Thank you for being here on the last night of our 9th annual Cap Times Idea Fest. As always, I want to just point out our sponsors who are on the banners behind me. They really do make this week possible. I have a prediction about this session. I predict you'll remember this evening's first session on Christian nationalism as one of the most thought-provoking of the week. I'm deeply grateful to Sam Freedman for returning from New York City to moderate a session again this year. David Emeritus introduced me to Sam a year ago, and Sam was part of a much talked about Idea Fest session last year on Midwestern progressivism, its history and its future. And it was much talked about. It was just terrific. And Sam contacted me in the spring and said he was interested in coming back, and I jumped at it on all of our behalfs. Sam is an emeritus professor at the Columbia University Journalism School, as an author, and was a reporter and columnist for the New York Times, among his many other credentials. This spring, Sam suggested a session on Christian nationalism, and all I can do is marvel at how prescient he was. He'll be joined on stage by two of the nation's most respected experts on the subject. Reverend Angela Denker is a Lutheran pastor from Minneapolis and a columnist for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. She's written 2 books on Christian nationalism. Her first was titled Red State Christians, and her latest book is Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood, which was published in March. She has written for the Washington Post, Fortune magazine, has appeared on CNN, the BBC, Sky News, on NPR, all to share her research on politics and Christian nationalism. Robert Jones is the founder and president of Public Religion Research Institute and often hosts conversations about the intersections of religion, culture, and politics. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, published in 2023, as well as 2021's White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. All 4 of the books I've mentioned are on sale in the lobby, and the authors will be available after this session to autograph them. Robert has written for The Atlantic, Time, the Religion News Service, and other outlets. He's frequently featured in media, including CNN, MSNBC, NPR, The Times, The Post, and others. He has a weekly newsletter titled White Too Long. I'm not sure how one could convene a more esteemed panel on such a crucial and critically timely topic. So would you join me in welcoming our 3 guests to the stage tonight with a big Madison welcome. Thank you.
Paul, thank you so much for introducing us all. It is a joy and an honor to be back as part of Idea Fest moderating this year, and to be back in Madison and at UW, where I graduated in 1977 and met my wife, Chris, who's out there somewhere, in a comp lit class almost 49 years ago, almost to the day. Yeah, it's definite awe material. And I have to go back to that period of time as a preamble to the trenchant discussion we're about to have. So at the end of my junior year, in the spring of '76, when the Democrats were starting to run in profusion that year for the Democratic nomination for president, I had this lively discussion with my roommates who I was living with up on Van Nuys Terrace up above Camp Randall Stadium, or Van Nuys Ave, about who we were all going to support in the primary. I was a Fred Harris supporter myself. And back when populism meant something else. And that was the campaign when a lot of us heard for the first time from the candidate Jimmy Carter the descriptor born again Christian. For a lot of us who didn't come out of evangelical homes, that was a new piece of nomenclature. And what happened when Jimmy Carter, as an evangelical, ran that fall, he turned out evangelical voters in numbers that had not been seen before, because there was a tradition, I think it's probably actually overstated by some people, but nonetheless real, that to be an evangelical Christian, particularly of the fundamentalist sort, since the two things have a Venn diagram, but they're not the same, meant to work on one's holiness, one's purity, to prepare for the afterlife, and that things like partisan politics was the business of this world. Well, Jimmy Carter's election in 1976 began to change that. 4 years later, when Ronald Reagan ran, the number of evangelical voters and their percentage of the voting public increased again, but their alliance shifted to the right. They voted against, actually, their own evangelical Jimmy Carter to become a pillar of the Reagan coalition and to remain so. And I think for a lot of us, starting at that time, we became familiar with certain people, Reverend Jerry Falwell, Reverend Pat Robertson, the political operative Ralph Reed, the organization Moral Majority, and the phrase, the Christian right. And as the decades went on past then, it became a norm within American partisan politics to think of that evangelical vote, and I should say specifically the white evangelical vote, because just as a data point and a definitional point, most black Christians, other than Catholics, would be classified as evangelicals themselves, but black evangelical Christianity has a very, very different political orientation than white evangelical Christianity. So keep in mind, when we're talking tonight, if we don't always use the racial term white to remind you, we're really talking about white evangelicals here. But in any case, it was assumed that the evangelical vote was part of the Republican coalition, that groups like Moral Majority were going to keep pushing for their issues, rolling back Roe v. Wade, school vouchers, and so forth. And now we come to what could be called the Trump era, these last 9 or 10 years, when another term has come into use, which is Christian nationalism. And Madison being Madison, I realize that for a lot of you that may not be a familiar term, or when you think you know are a little bit fuzzy on. But it's hugely important in the politics, the culture, the religion of our country, and we're lucky to have in Angela Denker and Robbie Jones, and they gave me the okay to use their first names, so I want you to know I'm not dissing them. I have only the highest respect for them. But two people who have really been tracking what Christian nationalism is for a long time, in one case as a scholar, in another case as a theologian and journalist and public intellectual. And so the first thing I wanted to throw out to them to help us all come into a greater amount of knowledge is when we talk about Christian nationalism, what is it that we mean? And is this different from the same old moral majority, religious right that we were talking about as far back as the 1980s and the Reagan years? And if it's different, how so?
Okay, I'll jump in. Thank you for that small question to begin with. So I'm gonna pick up the historical thread. Yeah. I think is one way of getting at this. Yeah, my day job, I'm a sociologist. We do public opinion polling and demographic tracking of the American religion and culture at Public Religion Research Institute. But I'm going to tell a little bit of a personal story to get at this thing. So I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, as a Southern Baptist. Right? So very akin to Jimmy Carter was a Southern Baptist, right? Just down the road. My people, as we say in the South, are actually all from Macon, Georgia, 6 generations back on both sides of my family. In fact, my brother, sister, and I are the first generation since the late 1700s not to live in either Twiggs County or Bibb County, Georgia, right? But here's the thing. All of my grandparents, who were all Southern Baptists, evangelical Christians, would all claim the born-again label, were all Democrats. Now, let that sink in for a minute from where we are today, because it's really important to understand the kind of full circle that we've come to today. Now, how did they get to be Democrats in the Deep South, right, as evangelical Christians? Well, the short answer is Lincoln. Now, what's that about, right? Well, we were the Confederacy, right? Lincoln was the party of abolitionism, republicanism, Reconstruction, which, by the way, we overthrew and called redemption from our Christian tradition. So we were all staunch Democrats all the way up through. And it wasn't really until my college years in the 80s, as you said, with Reagan and after Carter. Carter actually was the hope, right, that tradition would continue. But here's the thing, the turning point when white Southern Christians moved from being staunch Democrats to Republicans wasn't about abortion. It wasn't about LGBTQ issues. It wasn't even about gender primarily. It was about race. The turning point for white Christians in the South moving from the Democratic Party, I would say the great white flight from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, was the Voting Rights Acts and the Civil Rights Acts in 1964 and 1965. And if we remember what happened there, and I'm going to cite one more Southern Baptist, someone who I had the great privilege of meeting before he passed away, Bill Moyers. Southern Baptist, you may or may not have known that. But when Johnson, they passed the Civil Rights Acts, on that day, he turned to Moyers, a Southern Baptist, and said, "We have lost the South for my lifetime and probably yours." Because he knew this dynamic was going on. So if we understand that as the sort of launch pad of the Christian right movement, again, not the kind of culture war issues we think about, but it was really about protecting white supremacy and using Christian arguments to do it. That's really the beginning, the kind of deep DNA of the Christian right movement. It then does pick up steam. It picks up these other issues along the way. But if you look at what got, the early Jerry Falwell Sr. moved him from saying that Christians should stay out of the pulpits and stay out of the streets, which, by the way, he meant as a criticism against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he said that. The thing that moved him from saying, "Oh, no, actually, we should be in the streets," was Bob Jones University, who was going to lose federal funding because they had a ban on interracial dating on campus and fell afoul of civil rights laws. Again, that's what moved them in. So when I talk about white Christian nationalism today, Christian nationalism, I usually do append that word white to the front of it, white Christian nationalism, just like white evangelicals. Not because whites are the only people who share Christian nationalist views, but overwhelmingly that is the political movement that we're seeing today. I'll end with this real quick. How do we measure it today? So we'll have something concrete to work with. We at PRI have done more public opinion polling on this than any other organization in the country. We have found very consistently since 2021, when we first started measuring this, that about 3 in 10 Americans share these views. And we measure these views based on a number of statements that are things like, U.S. laws should be based on the Bible. Christians should exercise dominion over all areas of society. If we move away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Those kinds of sentiments. Five measures, you can see it on our website at pri.org. We find about 3 in 10 Americans are either adherents or sympathizers, that is, who mostly agree with those views. Now that means that 2/3 of the country mostly disagrees with those views. But here's the thing, there are 2 groups that are in majority or supermajority agreeing with those statements. 55% of Republicans are Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers, and 2/3 of white evangelical Protestants, the base of that party, are Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. So what that means is that it's just kind of, even though it's only 1/3 of the country, it's captured a majority of one of our 2 political parties' view and have become the engine, really, of the MAGA movement that we've seen taking over the Republican Party. So I'll stop there, which is kind of what it is in that history.
Yes. Well, I love whenever Robbie and I get to be up here together and talk about this topic because we come from very different places. We have very different backgrounds. We come from very different churches. He is a Southern Baptist from the South. I am a Northern Lutheran from Minnesota. And nonetheless, we come to the same conclusions. And so I think it's very important to understand the ways in which this data and this history is leading us to a similar place. We're talking about this history in America, and often, in America, we have a tendency to be very parochial and see everything through an American lens. And so when I first started talking to groups about Christian nationalism almost a decade ago, one of the first things that I would always try to divorce people's notions from is this idea that understanding Christian nationalism and even understanding the role of Christianity in politics has to be understood as a specifically partisan issue. The real roots of Christian nationalism can be found all the way back to the Crusades. The same motivation that those crusaders had going into the Holy Land, to a place that already had Christians living there, right? But they weren't the right kind of Christians. Those same motivations are the same motivations that are active in those who are leading our American government today, which is why it's really precedent and really telling that our defense secretary, hometown of Forest Lake, Minnesota, know him well, Pete Hegseth, he has Crusader tattoos. And what we've been watching in this movement as it transitions to a more violent and intense place is we've been seeing more and more imagery like that, more violent imagery, more overtly masculine imagery. So let me get back. I want to tell a little bit about how I first got into learning about Christian nationalism, again, as a Lutheran. And what's relevant also for me in talking about this really fun topic that makes me really popular in the neighborhood, and, all the other parents on the sports fields just love talking to me about my job. I'm called into this, like kicking and screaming sometimes, partly because I come from German Lutheran heritage, and we all love to claim Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But the reality is that most of my compatriots were signing oaths of allegiance to Hitler and to the German Christian church. And there's a tendency here in the upper Midwest that I know well, which is that you want to be polite, you don't want to talk too much about things that might offend other people. And too many of us Christians who don't subscribe to Christian nationalism have been cowed into silence. And so for me as a pastor, I cannot abide that. So what I want to do, yeah, you know what? We're still here. Our churches are dying. We've been hearing it for years, but we're still here, right? And we're going to make some noise. So I first heard the term Christian nationalism back actually in 2018, January, at the March for Life in Washington, D.C. It was the first time a sitting president had ever addressed the March for Life, Donald Trump. I was there as a researcher, beginning work on my first book, Red State Christians. And at that time, within the Southern Baptist Convention, a group called the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, I came to their gathering to interview some pastors who were on that board. And at that time, there was still a little bit of space within the SBC to criticize Trump. So Pastor Dean and Sarah, he pastors a church in Tallahassee, Florida. He hates that I bring this up now because he would deny it. He'd say I'd never say that, but he did. He pulled me aside. He heard I was researching Trump's victory among Christians in 2016. And he told me, the thing that you need to get at the heart of your book, at the heart of the reason why Christians coalesce around Trump, is Christian nationalism. And he said, Christian nationalism is a gospel distortion within the Southern Baptist Convention. And I'd say within the American church, the white American church. He said, this distortion has gotten so big that it has crowded out the gospel of Jesus to the point to which if you go to a Southern Baptist church on 4th of July weekend, you may as well be sitting at a baseball game eating a hot dog. Jesus has been completely crowded out by America and been replaced with a caricature of Jesus. So he told me on 4th of July weekend to go to Prestonwood Baptist Church in Plano, Texas. And that's where my beginning of Christian nationalism came to be understood. Real quickly, I want to read my definition of Christian nationalism, and then we'll get into a conversation. Christian nationalism is a version of the idolatrous theology of glory, which replaces the genuine worship of God with worship of a particular vision of America, often rooted in a revisionist history of white people in the 1950s. Now this is where they get at our nostalgia, because in every church that I've pastored, I've heard about the glory days of the white church back in the 1950s. And so they get at, oh, our Sunday school rooms were full. The church, everybody loved going to church. But they don't want full Sunday school rooms. They want a repeal of the Civil Rights Act, which you're hearing them say more and more now. Rooted in a revisionist history of white people in the 1950s, before the Civil Rights Movement or the women's movement. This is why they're talking about taking away the vote from married women. Christian nationalism supports a violent takeover of government. The violence is an important part here. We saw this on January 6th. And the imposition of fundamentalist Christian beliefs on all people. This is not a conservative religious movement, it's fundamentalist. Christian nationalism relies on a theological argument that equates American military sacrifice with Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. They're transforming our American military from a military that's designed to defend ideals to a military that's designed to defend the leader of the country and also a particular ethnic vision of America, much like the Russian military. Christian nationalism suggests that Christians are entitled to wealth and power. This is why you see all the anger about if they don't have that in greater amounts than other people in the country, because there's a sense of entitlement as a part of this movement. In contrast here to Jesus' theology of the cross, which reminds Christians that they too have to carry their cross, just as our crucified Savior did. So it's a divergence between this historical Christian story that's filled with stories of folks like Martin Luther King Jr. who were killed for their beliefs, and it's contrasted with a prosperity gospel story, which says that if you're Christian and if you follow Jesus, you're going to be rich and powerful and above everybody else. Let's move on.
I want to go. I'd like to go 2 questions later into the theological weeds with both of you, but right now I want to be in the demographic weeds. So Robbie, one of your books was titled, I may have to cite you off, but The End of White Christian America. And the terrific social science work that you have done showed the diminishing share of the American population and or the American electorate that identified as white evangelical Christian. And so my demographic question for you, and hold off on answering it till I give Angela hers, I'll get them both out there at the same time, is if this was a population that was diminishing, has it suddenly bounced back demographically, or how has it leveraged decreasing or at best static numbers into exponentially larger political power? How does that seeming contradiction operate? Because obviously it is operating. And then Angela, for you, you come out of a Christian tradition, the so-called Mainline Protestant tradition, that would have been seen as the epitome of American Christianity, really from the Eisenhower years through the Nixon years and maybe beyond. These, if you don't know this, we're talking about denominations like Lutherans, United Methodist, United Church of Christ, American Baptist Church rather than Southern Baptist, and so forth, that were theologically moderate, politically moderate, that really virtually every American president, correct me if I'm wrong, until Jimmy Carter came from one of those denominations. And so what has happened to the influence, and Robbie may be able to speak to the numbers, or maybe you can't too, but where is the countervailing influence that mainline Protestantism might be expected to have against Christian nationalism?
All right, I don't have my handy PowerPoint slides here, but I'll do my best. So this is a 2016 book that I wrote before actually any of the MAGA or Trump movement was even on the horizon. I was using 2014 data in that book, but what I had noticed was this peculiar and steady decline of white Christians in the country. Now, we've been hearing for some time, you already mentioned, Angela, that the mainline Protestant denominations, like those affiliated with the National Council of Churches, had all been, their internal reports had been saying for years, really since the 70s, that they've been experiencing these declines, and were very much concerned about that. But there was the sense that the evangelical churches were growing, right, at the same time, which meant lots of opportunities for our people to throw shade on your people during those years, which we did abundantly, right? There's a whole like sociological literature about why strict churches are growing and why liberal churches are dying, like all of those kind of tropes. Well, here's what's interesting. That if you track it, for sure, if you take all white Christians in the country, and this is kind of what I was tracking, this milestone in the end of white Christian America, is that we had moved really only in the last 20 years from being a majority white Christian country to one that was no longer a majority white Christian country. So we had moved that sea change. Now, demographic studies that only look at race have been telling us for some time that like in the year 2042, we'll be a majority non-white country. But I think that's actually less important culturally than this ethno-religious identity, right? It's always been about white and Christian, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. We even like WASP, right? We have an acronym for that because those people were running the country, right? And so this shift, I think, was quite something for really for white Christians in the country to wrap their heads around. That they were no longer the demographic majority in the country. So here are the numbers. If we go back just as recently as 2008, when Barack Obama, our first black president, was running for president, the country was still comfortably 54% white and Christian. Fast forward just 8 years, at the end of his second term, that number had gone from 54% to 47%. So now, just by coincidence, right, we had gone through this sea change of being going from being a majority white Christian country to one that's no longer a majority white Christian country, while we had a black man sitting in the White House. And I think that this was something that people felt, right? This shifting demographics in country, even though they didn't know the stats, they think, by the way, that number today is 41, right, percent. So 54 to 41% today. What's interesting about that, the three major subgroups that we pay attention to as sociologists that can measure pretty regularly are white evangelicals, which you've heard a lot about, the more conservative, southern-based branch of the white Christian family. But there's two others, the white mainline Protestant branch. Those are non-evangelical Christians, typically more Midwest, upper Northeast, and white Catholics. If we kind of look at all of those groups, they've all been declining over this time. But what's interesting is that there's no group that has declined more, to your question, Sam, in the last 20 years than white evangelical Protestants. They have gone from being nearly a quarter of the country by themselves in the same period, early 2000s, to being 13% of the country today. Now, like everybody's like, wait, 13, 1, 3, yes. And the number of white mainline Protestants in the country is 13%. They are the same size today. They've gone from being nearly twice the size of white mainline Protestants to being the same size today. But I think that these things, the sort of like decline and the extremism, go hand in hand. Right? There is this sense, and you'll hear it all the time, we have to reclaim America. We're losing America. We need a revival in America. We're going to reclaim, redeem, all these re-words. Even the last word in the MAGA mantra is not about America, and it's not about greatness. You've already mentioned the word. It's about nostalgia. That's the power of this movement. It's again, right? We're reclaiming, and what are we reclaiming? We're reclaiming white Christian dominance is what we're claiming in the country. Like that we have this sense of entitlement and all the stuff around Manifest Destiny and America as a New Zion and America as a promised land. And the question is, for whom? And there's only been one answer historically for that in American history, and that has been, it is a promised land for Christians of European descent. That's been the answer.
Can I just quickly ask a follow-up, and then I'll get it right over to Angela. So if they're 13%, I understand how attitudinally that leads to this rhetoric about we're endangered, we're losing our country, we have to fight to reclaim it. But that's not tantamount to winning political power with 13%. So how is it they've acquired, seemingly, correct me if I'm wrong, so much more political power from a 13% share?
Well, one of the main reasons is they've completely loaded themselves into one political party. So if we were a European country with 5 or 6 groups, they'd be loaded into one party on the right. It'd be the sort of, Christian Nationalist Party, and it would get 30% of the vote, and that'd be the end of it. But because they'd pick up a few other folks as well. But what they've been able to do in our binary system is take over one political party. They're more than a third of Republicans. Right, and so they're 13% of the country, but they're more than a third of Republicans. And the other thing I should say, lest the other 2 white Christian groups completely get off the hook here, the only piece I wrote as a kind of post-mortem piece after the last presidential election was a piece I wrote at Time magazine called "What White Christians Have Wrought." And now you notice I didn't say what white evangelicals have wrought. I said what white Christians have wrought. Because the truth is, every time Donald Trump has been on the ballot, he's gotten 80 to 85% of white evangelical votes, but he's gotten 60% of white mainline Protestant votes and 60% of white Catholic votes. And every time he's been on the ballot, it's been very, very steady, right? So that other piece is kind of what, in our binary system, and let's just go ahead and talk about gerrymandering and the imbalances of the electoral college system, and you add all that together and you can squeak across the finish line in a presidential election.
And suppression of the vote. And I think also we really saw in this most recent presidential election the role of nihilism. And so this messaging from this group, coupled with the messaging that you're seeing out of most other white Christian traditions in this country, which is pretty dire and despairing, it leads a lot of folks to nihilism. And particularly, I think we saw in this state and in Michigan, what happened electorally when so many people decided to stay home. So I think that's a big part of it as well, is they're suppressing they're enthusiastically energizing their own voters and making everybody else feel defeated and nihilistic and hopeless. So I love the question because I love the opportunity.
Well, it was about kind of whether the mainstream in this, and why can't it fight back more effectively?
Yes, and I love the question because I get to talk about theology. And a lot of times in America in 2025, you say you're a theologian, you study theology. People think, what the heck, where did you come from? And why is that important? And what I think a lot of, especially American media, fails to understand when covering Christian nationalism, and I say this as someone I have a journalism degree. I started my career in newspapers, have continued to work as a journalist after going to seminary. I've been ordained over 10 years in the LCA. What I see in American media is there's this disconnect and this inability to understand the power of the narrative around who God is in a Christian nationalist sense that has overtaken the understanding of who God is for much of America. And so their privileging of covering religion and covering Christianity specifically overwhelmingly on the right, and telling stories exclusively about Christianity that are stories of conservative Christians, stories of evangelicals, has led most of the country, regardless of if people go to church, regardless if you have any personal connection to a faith community, if you ask the average person in this country, what are some characteristics of an American Christian? What do they believe? What do they look like? You're not going to hear about the black church. You're probably not going to hear about Lutherans, I'm sorry. You're going to hear about whiteness, you're going to hear about conservatism, you're going to hear about abortion, you're going to hear about gay rights. So that theological story about who God is, and specifically the embrace of the theology of glory as the dominant way that Americans understand who God is, has led to an uncritical embrace of Christian nationalism without a countervailing story to compete against it, which is the theology of the cross. And when we're talking about the white mainline churches found themselves, as you both have noted, at the center of seats of American power for much of the 20th century, particularly in the post-World War II years. And so when you always have a seat at the table, when every single U.S. president comes from, no Lutherans yet, maybe Tim Walz will get there, but when Episcopalians, Presbyterians, when you take for granted that your tradition is naturally going to be the one that is lifted up in American government, in politics, in seats of power, then you start to lose the story of Jesus and the story of Christianity, which began as a persecuted minority religion out of the Jewish faith. I can leave it there.
You left me at a perfect juncture, Angela. I appreciate it. Angela's a big basketball player, her whole life, basketball mom now, so that was a great assist. She's doing major on the plus-minus chart.
You're going to dunk now, right, Sam?
In any case, but I do want to go even further, transitioning off what you were just saying into the theology. Now, on the one hand, there's been a lot of polling by Robbie, by Pew, by others that confirms the fact that for many people who identify as white evangelicals, it's become a cultural signifier as much as a thought-through religious experience, or even one based on regular church attendance. So I understand that that's out there too. But I'm curious, what are the stories out of Scripture, what are the parts of holy text that Christian nationalists use to propound their message? Because as someone who's written a lot about Black Christianity, for instance, as a counterpoint, you could boil down Black Christianity's liberation theology to Jesus being seen as a liberator of the oppressed, the Exodus narrative, and the Old Testament social justice prophets. I mean, there are other textual bases, of course, but that's the three-legged stool of Black liberation theology. And so for Christian nationalists, what are the parts of text or the glosses on text that they use to claim theological high ground?
All right. Well, I'm going to talk about a couple of texts, but I also want to note that, again, part of this narrative that Christian nationalists have told about themselves is that their churches are the Bible-based churches. Now, as a Lutheran pastor, I've had many a church member over the last 10 plus years tell me that they were leaving my church to go to a Bible-based church. What does a Bible-based church mean in this movement? It means that gay people can't get married. It means that women can't get reproductive health care. And it means also that I, as a woman pastor, would not be welcome in the pulpit at that church. So really, we have to first say, yes, they use some Bible stories, but this movement takes advantage of the fact that there is huge amounts of biblical illiteracy among American Christians. The first Bible story I just want to mention briefly is Adam and Eve. Because gender, this is how you can tell this is a fundamentalist movement, and this part of the movement is growing and intensifying in Trump's second term. It's a very different story than it was in the first term. The story of Adam and Eve, because the story of Adam and Eve, they use as a way to set up the world that God has created according to a hierarchy. Now notice, in the biblical, there's multiple creation stories in the Bible. Adam and Eve is one of the creation stories. There's also a creation story of the creation on different days. But the Adam and Eve story is prized by Christian nationalists. You'll hear them preach about it all the time, talk about it all the time. And one of the reasons they love it is that women get to be the bad guy. Men get to be atop the hierarchy, even if when we look at the Hebrew, when we do the translation, this really isn't about gender. But the Adam and Eve story, and also this introduction of sin. No, sin comes through the woman. All of these are central to the ideology of Christian nationalism, and also getting at this sense that badness and evil comes from somewhere else other than the first man. The second story that they really like to talk about, which is interesting, is the story of Jesus flipping over the tables in the temple. Because it sets up Jesus as an angry, vindictive leader. Now, what they don't talk about is the reason why Jesus was flipping over tables in the temple. He was flipping over tables in the temple because the money changers had taken over the temple, and they were using and making the temple from a holy place into a place for thieves. Jesus only, his main moment of great anger came when he saw religion being corrupted by money-making and grift.
All right. Well, I hate following the Reverend on the Bible, but
You can do the altar call.
I did go to seminary, but didn't get ordained. But here's what I think about is that I grew up, again, very religious. I was that kid. I was at church 5 days a week, right? And that was normal in the Southern Baptist world, by the way. I wasn't some outlier in that regard. But when I think about what I heard, so if there was a sermon that got preached in our church, I heard it because I was there. I never heard a sermon on racial justice the entire time I grew up in Mississippi. Never, right? And I lived through desegregation. Believe it or not, so in third grade in 1976 was when Jackson, Mississippi Public Schools finally got around to desegregating their schools. 22 years after Brown v. Board, mostly because white Christians helped the state drag their feet, right? And when they finally stopped dragging their feet, we got white Christian academies cropping up all over the state so that our good white Christian kids would not have to go to school with their black classmates, right? So that was the Christian witness. And so the thing that when I think about the Bible and how it's been used, I keep wanting to say okay, wait, to my people, so wait, we're going to say that we have got a lock on what the Bible says about whatever it is after that track record? Right? After the track record on segregation, after the track record on slavery, just one quick digression. So I have my family Bible. As mentioned, we're way back. I have the family Bible from the late 1700s for my mother's side of the family. It's that kind of old Bible. It's got genealogical section between the Old and New Testaments. I've got 4 generations of my family in there. The guy who was my 6th or 8th grandfather's name was Pleasant Moon. It was a British name. I also found later the estate settlement from his uncle for whom he was named. I didn't find his, but his uncle. So my 7th great uncle. And what I found in that family that so valued this Bible, that handed it down and used it and all that, was of course an estate settlement that showed that their family owned 4 human beings. Right? And so today I've got a printout of that estate settlement tucked inside the Bible at those genealogical pages. So the next generations down the line are going to find, this Bible that we valued so much and how we misused it, right, in that time. So that's the thing about the Bible is I think the Bible ends up getting used more like a token or a totem today than anything that we're actually reading or trying to look at what Jesus did or didn't say. And I think for me, the kind of biggest example of that was Trump violently clearing Lafayette Square and getting Milley to walk across in his military uniform. By the way, he wanted to use rubber bullets on the nonviolent protesters that day, and they wouldn't let him. So that he could march over to a church and awkwardly hold up a Bible.
And correct me if I'm wrong, he held it up upside down, didn't he?
Oh, yes, and he held it upside down for a photo op. This is the man who talks about 2 Corinthians, right, in the New Testament. And that to me was the epitome of it, right? That's the use of the Bible. It's a photo op. It's a totem. And I think we've got to really take that seriously. And the way that document has been misused so obviously in our recent history that no one from that sort of white Southern evangelical world for sure should be standing up and saying we've got a lock on biblical truth.
I just want to jump in real quick on something. Yeah. Something that Robbie said that connects to the question that Sam asked earlier about the inability of the mainline church to push back against this movement. When Robbie said he grew up, he never heard a sermon on racial justice. Neither did I. Neither did I. We didn't talk about that in the white Lutheran church in the Minneapolis suburbs. I went to Lutheran seminary for 4 years. It had a great education, but I never heard of James Baldwin until years after I went to seminary. So part of the reason that white mainline churches have been unable to push back against this movement is we've othered the movement. We've made it a movement of the South. We've made it a movement of evangelicals, and we have not reckoned with the level of white privilege and white supremacy within our own traditions as well. And even when you're talking about segregation academies, I'm looking in Minnesota, I'm looking in Wisconsin, and we see the attacks on public schools and the private schools that are propping up and the things that they're teaching in those private schools and the books that they're banning in those private schools. They're academies also for white students. They're coming up for the same reason, and that's the reason why they're attacking our public schools.
Where does immigration fit into this? I think Robbie and Andrew, you both sort of grazed up against this, but I'd like to address it directly, because out of the experience you talk about so eloquently growing up as a Southern Baptist and the role of the white church in the South as a handmaiden of segregation and the post-Civil Rights Act movement of white Christians in the South from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, all that makes sense. But here we are in the North, places that have become very MAGA infused, not Madison itself, but we know plenty of other parts of this state, and Michigan, Minnesota, the Dakotas, you could go on and on. These are all places that fought for the Union rather than the Confederacy. These are all places that outside of a few major urban areas didn't have a particularly large African-American populations, and even though there's a lot of de facto segregation in the way lives were lived, didn't engage in a de jure segregation that was the coin of the realm in the former Confederacy. But these are states that have become increasingly racially diverse and religiously diverse, and I'm wondering what the anxiety and backlash against that tells us about why Christian nationalism would get its foothold into the former Union, as well as a bit more predictably, the former Confederacy.
Well, I'll start. So in my most recent book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, I have a chapter on Mississippi, which gives some of the story that I've told. I also have a story in Oklahoma, another bright red state, right? But I also have a story, I have 3 chapters on Minnesota, because I didn't want to just pick on the South, so I picked on Angela's state. But what I discovered is that in order to kind of get a clearer focus, because it is a little blurry the way you describe it, it's a little hazy, it doesn't make quite sense, it doesn't quite click. So what's going on? You have to kind of take another step back. And if you take another step back, we're right here on the banks of Lake Mendota, right? And we have to tell another story that's related to the story that we've been talking about. It's mostly a black-white story. And that's the story of the treatment of indigenous people in this country. So we're here, Lake Mendota, right? There's Mendota Heights in Minneapolis, right? That's, by the way, right next to a big fort, right? That took over that sacred area that was sacred to the native people there. And we have to tell that story, because what that story helps us snap into focus is that this has not just been an anti-black thing. Right? This has been, again, I mentioned Manifest Destiny, this idea of America as a promised land for Christians of European descent. That's the deep DNA that we're dealing with. And we really have been in a place where we've had a kind of 2 visions of the country competing for our allegiances throughout our entire history. We're going to be celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence next year. You should all buckle up for that, because it is going to come front and center. Who are we? This question, right? And this old tradition that has always been with us, that we are an American Zion. This land is our land, right? That comes from one of our more liberated singers, right? This land is our land. Well, whose? Exactly, but I think when we take this seriously, we have to realize that kind of the same forces that we've been talking about with slavery and whether we're talking about today police violence and George Floyd, or whether we're talking about segregation in Mississippi, if we go back, it is the same force, that preservation of all things good and wonderful for white Christian people. That's the thing that we're struggling to let go of. And it is a thing that's a kind of desperate, shrinking portion of our population is so desperately trying to hang on to, and if they can't do it democratically, they're trying to hang on to it by force. And that's what we're really struggling with.
Yeah. I want to talk about what's happening in the rural Midwest. So from 2019 to 2023, I was living with my family in Southwest Minneapolis, and I was driving an hour west to McLeod County in Minnesota, a place where 80% voted for Trump in 2020 and 2024, to pastor a congregation in a little town of less than 1,000 people. And so my congregation and I lived together through George Floyd. We lived together through January 6th. We lived together through COVID. And what's happening in the rural Midwest and this embrace of Christian nationalism among rural Midwesterners is one of the things about this movement that just absolutely breaks my heart. I come from rural Midwestern stock. You know, my ancestors came from Germany. One of them was a Lutheran pastor. The others were German Catholics. They lived in a town where they only spoke German up until pretty recently. And there's a work ethic that does come in Midwestern farm people. There's a caring for one another that comes in rural America. And I saw it at the church that I worked at. You know, we didn't pay for snow removal. We didn't pay for anyone to mow the lawn. We didn't pay for anyone to come in and fix up the church. The people of the church took care of that because it was their church and they cared about it. And if somebody was sick and their farm fields weren't getting taken care of, the neighbor would come over and take care of the farm. This culture of care and reciprocity has been ripped apart and shredded by the embrace of Christian nationalism in these places. And it's broken my heart over and over and over again. And as Robbie notes, a lot of the attraction to this movement is an aesthetic attraction. It's not a deep attraction to the deep meaning, the deep theology. It's not an ideological attraction. Fundamentally, it's not this is why you can't rationally argue people out of a Christian nationalist mindset. It's an aesthetic orientation based on nostalgia and based on an image of what people think America is, and it is wrapped up in whiteness. And so it's no surprise that in the rural Midwest, as we've seen the Midwest become less and less white. And again, you know, Germans and Scandinavians in Minnesota didn't get along. It wasn't some white utopia. That's why we have, 4 Lutheran churches in every small town, because we need one for the Norwegians, one for the Swedes, one for the Germans. So this story of whiteness blurs those lines. It ignores our treatment of indigenous Minnesotans, a shameful history that I did not learn in junior high. I learned we were the good guys in the Civil War. This history of whiteness, it allows people to ascribe to a sense that makes them feel proud again at a time when family farms are failing. When I heard all kinds of stories about suicides in grain elevators, when we have huge rates of car accidents, of drug addictions, of despair, and it's a fertile ground for then when you see, well, we have some immigrant workers coming to work on the farms, because now all the farms are owned for the most part by large conglomerations, and they need cheap labor to actually do the work that used to be done by people who actually own the farm. It's ripe and fertile ground to say, well, here's some convenient people to blame for what's happening. How about these East African folks who have come to your town? How about these Hispanic workers who have come up? That's who you need to blame for why things aren't going well in rural America, not the big corporations, not the folks who have taken away your ability to make a living by buying up everything, but blame these other people. So a lot of times, Trump, sometimes he gets at the problem. He understands instinctively what people are mad about, and then he tells them that the problem is non-white Americans, gay Americans, women.
I wanted to go into two. Sorry to step on the applause there. we're unfortunately already running close to the end of our allotted time, but I want to go into, while we still have some of it left, 2 areas we haven't addressed head on yet. One is gender, the other is age. And I'll kick this one right back to Angela, and then it can go over to Robbie after you. You have written an entire book about the enticements that Christian nationalism offers to young men. What are those enticements? How has Christian nationalism become successful? What's it offering, and why is that being bought?
Again, it's an aesthetic promise, and it's a very thin offer, but you can see it, and you can see it really gendered. So this offer that they're making to young men, there's a flip side of an offer that they're making to young women as well. So the offer to young men is you can be a provider, you can be a father, you don't have to be exceptional. You can just go, and it's kind of the dream that we used to a little bit have in America when we had more union jobs, when we had more ways for people to make a middle-class living. They tell young men, you can have that again, and they really appeal. What I want people to understand, too, in studying this for a long time and doing lots of interviews with teenagers and with young men, with teachers, with coaches, with pastors, the appeal of this movement, it's such a false masculine strength. You know, I began my career working in pro sports. I've spent a lot of time with men who kind of fit into the mold that the Christian nationalists want you to think that they're in. Now, men who are actually strong, who are actually confident in their masculinity, they don't need to lord it over others. So the promise of this movement and the young men and boys who they're appealing to are the boys who are already on the outs. It's the same story, unfortunately, that you hear about school shooters. It's the ones who are lonely. It's the ones who don't fit into a box. And particularly in places like rural America, where, you know, if you're not on the football team or if you're not in the band, then you're on your own. There's not a lot of places for the ones who don't fit in. So that's what the appeal is, and that's what the promise is. And the flip side promise appeal for women is the trad wife movement. So go look it up if you don't know what that is yet. But it is a multi-million-dollar industry in fashion. So the puff sleeve dresses, I usually wear one when I do these so I can demonstrate for people. But the exaggerated femininity, if you'll notice, the women who are in Trump's orbit in this second administration, they all have a certain look. There's a huge amount of plastic surgery. There's the hairstyle. This is for a reason, because, again, this is an aesthetic appeal. It's for men, too. The most popular surgery for men in Washington is a chin implant, because they can look more masculine then. So this is, again, it's a promise, it's an appeal to a life that economically is no longer possible in this country unless you have access to inherited wealth. But it's being sold on social media. It's being sold to young people as this ideal. And it's attractive at a time for young people, for people my age, I'm 40, where it's historically difficult to buy a home, to afford rent, to raise children, to afford your health insurance. All of these conditions have created, again, a ripe recruiting ground for Christian nationalism. And the gender piece is a huge part of it, because it tells men and it tells boys that this is your chance to be king of your castle. And if your wife doesn't want to have sex with you, well, that's your right as a husband. If your wife doesn't want to listen to you, then you have to spank her. This is real, and this is teachings that have been going on under the radar in Christian congregations across this country for decades, but now it's being platformed on a big scale, and it's dangerous.
Well, first, I just want to take a deep breath And the thing that I think has always struck me about this, about the gender relationships, and the thing that bridges the gender to immigration, to race, is hierarchy. Right. That one thing this movement does is that it is a God-ordained hierarchy. Right, and it is men over women, it is parents over children, it is white over non-white, it is American over non-American. Everything is a hierarchy with white, straight men on top. Right, that's the kind of hierarchy of it. And so and I think what you're, in terms of thinking about what's the empathetic gravitational pull, I think you're right. I mean, in a time of economic uncertainty, of a lot of social change, a lot of demographic change, that's real happening in the country, right? All of a sudden you go into a grocery store and there's an ethnic food aisle, where you've never had one before. You flip the AM dial and your favorite country music station's been replaced by Tejano music, what's going on, right? I think that kind of dislocation is a sense of vertigo, cultural vertigo is real, and it offers clarity, right? But unfortunately, the clarity that it offers is in forms of these imprinted hierarchies and roles to play that are ultimately destructive.
We're very near the end. I want to say something before the end, which is that both Angela Denker and Robbie Jones will be in the lobby after our talk ends, selling and signing their books. So if your appetite has been whetted, as I hope it has by this conversation, there's much more nourishment for you. There's much more nourishment to be had out there at the book-selling station, and you get an autograph besides. So let me just close before we adjourn to buying books and ask each of you, we've talked about what the problems are, and this is sort of typical journalist, right? I'm going to convict myself here. I'll lay out the problems. Solution, not my department. I'm just the journalist around, or the author around here. Don't ask me. But 30 seconds apiece. What are some to-dos? Well, because we're running low on time, okay? Want to give you all time to buy books. And then get back here for Governor Pritzker, right? We've got quite a night. So in 30 seconds, what are a couple of to-dos for people of goodwill who are alarmed by this theocratic movement that we're facing in our endangered democracy and are looking for practical ways to counter it?
All right, you're gonna let me, I've already lost 5 of my seconds. All right, so I can't see very well because of the spotlight, but I do think I see a lot of white faces out there, people who look like me. Look, as I said in that Time article, our people, have wrought this upon the nation. And it is up to mostly us, right? People who look like us to help step into the breach now. Thank you. I think for too long, we've waited for African Americans to kind of lead us on the civil rights march. Well, this is our moment, right, to step up, to speak out. And I think we're going to have to do it in some really uncomfortable ways. And I know I'm in the Midwest, and I've got good Southern gentility, in me too, and propriety is an important norm and all of that, and civility. But we're going to have to ruffle some feathers. We're going to have to make some people uncomfortable. And we're going to have to say, look, this is destroying our democracy, and I can't just pretend that what you just said is okay. Right? We're going to have to be willing to do that if we really want to save our country. So I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I think much of us are in a place this week where much has been revealed. Maybe about people we know, maybe people in our families, about things that they believe, things that they embrace. I'll echo what Robbie says. This is ours to solve. I know if you're looking for spiritual guidance, a sense of who understands what to do in these moments, I will say in moments like this, I always turn to Black Christian leaders who have a sense, and maybe even were there during the civil rights movement, that is just an incredible wealth of inspiration and the roots of the soul of the theology of the cross in this country. So we have a precedent to follow as Christians, and I think we really need to listen to those leaders. And so the other advice I have, part of it comes from one of those leaders, Anthony Smith out of North Carolina. He says, this is the time when we need to form mutual aid networks So don't go looking for a national consultant or a national movement to sign up with, but look in your own neighborhood. Who are the people that you trust? Who are the people that are going to be there for you in a place of crisis? Do you have a text group? Do you have a sense for who can do what when needs arise? Do you know your neighbors? And so I think building up these local networks of support is really, really important, especially after COVID. And then the final thing I always say is that there's a lot of white men in this room, and you are really important and powerful to counter this movement. A lot of white men have said to me, you know, well, I wasn't raised with this version of Christianity. I don't know if I have anything to say about this. And that's exactly why you do. Because you have a different vision of masculinity. You have a masculine strength. You know how to lift up and embrace the women in your life. I would not be a journalist or a pastor today without white men in my life who've mentored me and given me opportunities and lifted up my voice. Thanks, Sam. And so I think that as white men, we need your voices desperately right now, because Black people and women and LGBTQ people are putting themselves on the line. And we're getting death threats. We're getting emails all the time about people coming to our house to kill us. And so we need your voices in media, in education, in business. We need your voices so dearly right now, and I want to encourage you to speak up and counter this vision of masculinity.
Well, the congregation has said amen. Reverend Angela Denker, Dr. Ravi Jones, thank you so much for enlightening us, edifying us. Again, please join them out at the book-selling station in the lobby, and thank you all for coming out and being part of the incredible Idea Fest.